From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. It's one thing to be an everyday American, feeling the ripple effects of decades of bad decisions by your government. It's another thing to be one of the people in the room where those decisions were being made. Robert Reich is one of those people. He was a member of 3 presidential administrations, including a stint as U.S. Labor Secretary. Reich is kind of like this Forrest Gump figure, showing up at all these pivotal historical moments. He found himself in the middle of Robert F. Kennedy's struggle over the Vietnam War. He was in the White House during Bill Clinton's battle over the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he was on the transition team when Barack Obama was backing away from the economic populism that he'd promised. All of those experiences have led Reich to now sound a loud alarm about the capitulation of the Democratic Party, the corruption of politics, and the potential collapse of American democracy. Today on Lever Time, I sit down with Robert Reich, who gives us a first-hand account of his fights with some of the country's most iconic politicians and power brokers. And he tells us what lessons he's learned about how to rescue America at this perilous moment in our history.
Both my parents worked. They worked hard. They worked 6 days a week. They owned a small business. They had 2 little clothing shops.
That's Robert Reich at his 1993 Senate confirmation hearing.
If I am confirmed as Secretary of Labor, I will dedicate myself to the well-being of all Americans who work, who want to work, who must work.
Reich soon after was confirmed to be President Bill Clinton's U.S. Labor Secretary. For many Americans, those confirmation hearings were their first introduction to Robert Reich. I remember that time pretty well. I was in the 10th grade. One of my classes assigned me to represent the Clinton-Gore campaign at a school debate. It was my first introduction to politics, and I was hooked. And I remember seeing that Reich was one of the most forceful advocates for workers in that first term of the new Clinton administration. Even back then, as U.S. Labor Secretary, Reich was warning Americans about the potential rise of someone like Donald Trump.
My friends, we are on the way to becoming a 2-tiered society, composed of a few winners and a larger group of Americans left behind, whose anger and whose disillusionment is easily manipulated. Once unbottled, mass resentment can poison the very fabric of society, the moral integrity of a society, replacing ambition with envy, replacing tolerance with hate.
That was Reich in the mid-1990s. You rarely hear cabinet secretaries give speeches like that, but it's a reminder that Reich has been a pretty unique force in Democratic politics for a very long time. Robert Reich is a baby boomer. He was born in 1946, the same year that 3 U.S. presidents were born: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. In his new book, Coming Up Short, Reich writes about how he's reckoning with the ways that his generation helped plunge Americans into the world we live in today, the darkest political moment that Reich has seen in his 79 years.
We are in grave danger, not just our democracy, but as individuals. This is not something that is anywhere close to anything that I expected, even from Donald Trump. And I certainly did not expect it in my lifetime.
Reich's life story kind of resembles Forrest Gump's. Reich has been present for countless critical moments in American history. But unlike Forrest Gump, Robert Reich wasn't a passive witness. He was an active participant.
David, I was there. I lived it. I lived it for many, many years. In fact, in some ways, I'm still living it.
Reich interned for New York Senator Robert F. Kennedy Sr. Reich attended Yale Law School, where he introduced Bill Clinton to Hillary Rodham in the dining hall. The 3 of them, plus future Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, were all in the same class, and one of those classes was taught by Robert Bork. Robert Reich is like the Kevin Bacon of politics. Everyone is only about 6 degrees away from him. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton tapped Reich to be in his presidential cabinet. Reich's new book includes details of his fights inside that White House and how he pressed Bill Clinton to deliver on his populist campaign promises and to resist the pull of the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party. Years later, Reich reprised a similar fight when newly elected President Obama asked him to be on his economic transition team. And then, as with Clinton, Obama largely sided with the Wall Street wing. Throughout the decades, Reich watched big business infiltrate the Democratic Party and abandon its New Deal roots, a change that's weakened the Democratic Party and created a vacuum that Donald Trump has taken advantage of. Reich told me that lots of people who are worried about what's happening right now still aren't focusing on the right issues.
Everybody says to me, who are you supporting for the next Democratic president? Well, I've been around politics long enough to know that is not the right question.
But what is the right question? To try to understand that, I asked Robert Reich to take us back in time on a walk through his political life and the lessons he's learned. Our first stop was the 1960s, that pivotal era of strife, conflict, and political violence that feels eerily similar to today. In that moment, Reich was an intern in the office of Senator and potential presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy. During that experience, Reich learned a lesson about the Democratic Party by getting upbraided by RFK.
I thought he'd be very proud of the fact that I organized all the interns of Democratic senators and Democratic members of Congress to sign a petition against the Vietnam War. He called me into his office, and I was anticipating him saying, good work, Bob. But he did just the opposite. He was furious, and with good reason. I mean, I was his intern. I didn't ask him in advance to do this. My name was on the petition. He said, I'm already having enough trouble with Lyndon Johnson without your goddamn, and there was a string of expletives. But the point was, I learned a very hard lesson. And it was a lesson personally that I needed to be a little bit more humble about what I was going to do in other people's names, but also I couldn't count on the Democrats. And that's why the following year, when I was a senior in college, I went out to be clean for Gene McCarthy, because Gene McCarthy had the guts as a senator to come out as the candidate that was the anti-war candidate. It took a while for Bobby Kennedy to enter the race as the anti-war candidate.
Bobby Kennedy's late entry into the 1968 presidential race and his belated anti-war message really resonated with voters, winning him California's Democratic primary and positioning him to win the Democratic nomination at his party's upcoming national convention.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you.
But Kennedy's campaign and his life were cut short by gunfire.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible?
Everybody else, just please stay back. Just a doctor, come right here.
A lot of Americans, including Reich, had hoped Kennedy would take the United States in a new direction. Reich writes in Coming Up Short that he believes Kennedy would have been nominated for president that summer and then elected in November of 1968. A Robert F. Kennedy presidency could have set the United States on a very different path during the 1970s, fighting poverty, developing stronger protections for farm workers and laborers, and fortifying the New Deal roots of the Democratic Party. But Kennedy's death and the ensuing victory of Richard Nixon moved the country in a dramatically different direction, one that culminated in a Republican revolution in 1980.
I think you all know that I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
In 1981, Ronald Reagan took over. Things changed. Taxes on the wealthy were reduced, that antitrust became a backwater, that is anti-monopoly, that labor unions began to be assaulted in ways they weren't before. Companies began to regard their workers and their environments and their communities as disposable. And I think that marked a major U-turn in the post-war world. And I think my generation and I were certainly coming into our majority. We were coming into our adulthood. And I think we failed to turn that ship around.
As the economy boomed through the 1980s and Reaganomics became entrenched in the American psyche, a growing faction of the Democratic leadership tried to steer their party to the right. This was the age of the so-called Atari Democrats and the Democratic Leadership Council, corporate-aligned factions that theorized that a more economically conservative Democratic Party could raise more campaign money from big business and appeal to wealthier voters who might be socially moderate, but who didn't like higher taxes or social spending. By the time Democrats reclaimed the presidency in 1992, many Democratic leaders seemed to believe that disaffected country club Republicans were the new target swing voters rather than working class voters. This Democratic faction seemed to believe they had to first and foremost appease Wall Street and big corporations. I talked to Robert Reich about how that view shaped the internal White House fights over the Clinton administration's policy priorities. I want to fast forward to the Clinton presidency because it's the first time a boomer becomes president. He was somebody that you write about knowing during law school. You're very friendly with him. He gets elected on a relatively populist platform in the wake of the Reagan Revolution, and he asks you to run his economic transition team. I want you to put us in that moment and tell us about the hopes that you felt, but also how you saw firsthand some of those hopes get swallowed up by the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party, by an obsession with deficits.
David, I can't describe to you. It's very difficult to describe. I tried in the book. Just the excitement of those first weeks after Bill Clinton was elected and the time leading up to him coming to Washington. This is after 12 years of Republicans in the White House, Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush. And it seemed like the Democratic Party was dead. But here you have this a new generation. It was like John F. Kennedy in 1960, a new generation coming to Washington, and Hillary Clinton, his wife, was also an activist with regard to children's issues. I remember just walking along the street and truck drivers honking and waving at me and saying, "Go, Mr. Clinton, tell Mr. Clinton we are for him." The country was excited by the possibility. But then coming into office, it became apparent that the Wall Street wing, corporate wing of the Democratic Party, did not want Bill Clinton to be nearly as progressive as Bill Clinton wanted to be. They were worried about the budget deficit. Bob Rubin, who is, I had nothing personally, we came from different worlds. He was a banker from Wall Street. He was appointed by Bill Clinton to be head of the National Economic Council, a key advisor. He and I saw the world completely differently. He thought the most important thing was to reduce the budget deficit. Lloyd Benson, Secretary of the Treasury under Bill Clinton, also thought deficit reduction was critical. Otherwise, Alan Greenspan, who was then the head of the Fed, would raise interest rates, and Bill Clinton might not even be reelected in 1996. So there's huge pressure to make deficit reduction the center of Bill Clinton's economic policies. I resisted as hard as I could. I thought that Bill Clinton's progressive agenda, investing in education and infrastructure and job training and jobs and helping people get new jobs that paid as well as the old jobs and adjust to a new knowledge-based economy, all of that seemed to be much more important than the budget deficit. But I lost most of those arguments.
You write about how Clinton endorsed the North American Free Trade Agreement with some caveats. But in a lot of ways, NAFTA created the conditions, I think, for Trump's ascent. It created the political and, I think, economic conditions in a lot of ways, and it became a symbol at the very least. And I think it's the same thing for financial deregulation. The deregulation of the Clinton years created some of the conditions ultimately for the financial crisis, which again created the conditions for the backlash that fueled Trump. How did you see NAFTA and financial deregulation at the time? And I think people completely forget about the Perot phenomenon. Like, that's just memory hold. Like, people don't even remember how important Ross Perot was in amplifying the criticism of NAFTA. How did you see all of that at the time? Could you see over the horizon that this was going to not just be sort of a one and done kind of set of legislative priorities, and that it was going to haunt American politics for the future decades?
I worried about it, David. I was in the awkward position that I think many people in an administration in Washington find themselves in, where I, inside, argued one thing and then publicly had to defend what the administration was doing. I was worried about NAFTA. I was even more worried about something we don't talk about much, but was even more important than NAFTA in terms of decimating manufacturing jobs in America, and that is the Chinese accession to the World Trade Organization. And I was very much opposed, although I was no longer in the administration when much of this occurred, to the deregulation of Wall Street. I argued that it was very important to make it easier for people to join labor unions. Labor law reform was very high on my agenda. I argued that we had to have stronger antitrust enforcement. These arguments did not find a highly receptive response. Bill Clinton, to his credit, expanded something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. I can see your eyes already glazing over. But that's important. It became the largest anti-poverty program in America. And Bill Clinton also gave me the green light to try to raise the minimum wage, which we succeeded in doing in 1996, even though Republicans controlled both houses of Congress. I was proud of many things we accomplished, but looking back, really from the vantage point of what happened to the American workforce, and ultimately the kind of depression, the demoralization that helped create the fertile field for Donald Trump, I think that we failed.
Question about Bill Clinton himself. There's a moment in your book where you write about Clinton seeming to have moments of misgivings, about essentially selling out. You write that, quote, often Bill went along with Bob Rubin, but not because Bob Rubin had better arguments. Bill was intimidated by Wall Street. You talk about him fearing the bond market. If Clinton was aware of these pressures, at one point you recount him saying we're becoming Eisenhower Republicans. If he's aware of this happening, and at moments he is frustrated with it, why do you think he succumbed?
Well, I can't get into his head now, and I certainly couldn't get into his head then, but I suspect that he succumbed because he felt that he had no choice, that if Clinton did not try to reduce the budget deficit, that Wall Street would react very negatively, as would Alan Greenspan at the Fed. And the economy would suffer, and Bill Clinton would not get reelected.
What about the question of money? This is at the moment now, it's pre-Citizens United in this particular moment. But clearly it's the era of big time fundraising, right? This is not the old 60s and 70s. I mean, money has always been a factor in American politics, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But I just wonder, what did you see of the influence of money? And I'm not talking necessarily about, cash in envelope kind of corruption, although we know that that happens all the time. I'm talking more about the influence of money in shaping the parameters of the discourse. I guess to put a finer point on it, how much of what Clinton did and didn't do, and the Clinton administration did and didn't do, was shaped by a fear of or a desire to appease the donor class?
Hard question to answer, because this was, remember, more than 30 years ago. This was at a time when money was clearly polluting our politics. Big money, and in a very substantial way. I mean, the Powell memo that I talk about in the book was 1971. So by the late 70s, you already had a tsunami of money coming into Washington, changing the character of the city, changing American politics. By 1993, when we were in office, it was obviously very, very important. And yet I didn't see any specific evidence that decisions were being made because of money or because Bill Clinton or anybody else wanted to court big money. There was also a cultural element because, and we don't talk about this nearly enough, because of all the money coming into Washington, a kind of glittering emerald city. It was not that way before. I was there in the 60s and 70s. It was kind of a seedy city, but it became this wealthy, rich city. And presidents and cabinet members and members of Congress all started to associate in terms of friendships and all the ways in which lunches and breakfasts and dinners are arranged with big, big money, with CEOs and the heads of Wall Street banks, would go to the Hamptons and places where even in the summer, big money hung out. It's very difficult to know how much of what happened was a matter of people wanting in Washington, trying to maintain those relationships because they wanted the money for their campaigns, and how much was a matter of a changing cultural dynamic in both parties.
Coming up next, I talk to Robert Reich about how the Democratic Party seemed to turn hope and change into more of the same during the Obama years. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time. After George W. Bush's disastrous presidency and the 2008 financial crisis, many Americans were drawn to Barack Obama's promise of hope and change.
If this financial crisis taught us anything, it's that we cannot have a thriving Wall Street while Main Street suffers. In this country, we rise or fall as one nation, as one people.
But things didn't quite play out that way. You write in your memoir about meeting Obama as a senator, and you ended up being one of his economic advisors during the transition. You write about how it's a great passage of your book where you write about how you feared that maybe you came off a little bit too strong in your own progressive values and excitement about what he could accomplish. And you write, quote, Obama seemed particularly anxious not to come off as too liberal. And I'm curious about those parallels, in a sense, between Obama and maybe Clinton, and this fear of seeming too progressive. And again, the context of this is at a time where there's the financial crisis, right? And Obama is coming into office with a much bigger mandate than Bill Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton won something in the 40s because there was essentially a three-way race. Obama comes in with the biggest mandate in a very, very long time. What parallels did you see, and were you frustrated by them?
Well, I was obviously frustrated by the parallels in both administrations. But one thing that I need to say about both the Clinton administration and the Obama administration is that the long shadow of Ronald Reagan really did, in a way, fall over both administrations. America still believed in trickle-down economics. Most Americans still thought that the working class was doing fairly well. It hadn't seeped into the public consciousness that inequality was as great, as wide, as awful as it was, and that with inequality came almost inevitably corruption in the form of legalized bribery. So we're still early in the story. And Barack Obama also, on top of all of this, I think, and this is maybe my own kind of analysis, watching him very carefully, I think he was very aware, as he should have been, that he was a black man, the first black president, and maybe he didn't want to come off as too radical, too extreme.
My feeling is that Obama created in a very deep and admirable way the expectation of hope and change, and in a lot of ways was perceived as delivering more of the same that created the conditions that he had promised to address. I mean, he ran a very populist 2008 presidential campaign. Comes in, he sort of extends the bailouts. The foreclosure crisis gets worse. The foreclosure program that he puts forward isn't really working. He's not really taking on the system. It seems to me that that was like the pivotal FDR moment that we missed.
I could not agree with you more. I think that was a pivotal moment because that's a moment at which the president and Congress really did have the bargaining power with Wall Street. I mean, the center of the American economy. Wall Street had become the center of the American economy. They had the power to basically say to Wall Street, you have got to do X, Y, and Z, or we're not going to bail you out. But there were voices inside the Obama administration from Wall Street. You know, every administration, every Democratic administration until Biden's had hired economic advisors directly from Wall Street. And those Wall Street advisors to Obama said, look, you've got to handle the banks very carefully, because if the banks are not bailed out, the entire economy is going to collapse. The banks are the ones we should thank for what they are about to do in terms of staying in the game and not collapsing. And that was just absurd. The one time that Obama met with the bankers, he called them fat cats, and they were livid. They thought, who is he to call us fat cats? Well, Obama, I think, missed a huge opportunity. He should have not only called them fat cats to themselves, just in that private meeting, he should have said to the public, they are fat cats. And we are going to, if we bail them out, then we are going to ask for all the People who are in danger of losing their homes, they are going to not foreclose on them. And we're going to say to them, you've got to change your loan terms so it's possible for small businesses and average working people to keep on going in this terrible Great Recession. And we're going to do this and this, and we're going to change this economy so it's not so dependent on Wall Street. But he didn't.
And that raises a question. I mean, I think politics is bigger than just individual people, but I also think individual people matter. And I always come back to this question about why are these people continuing to listen to people who have been wrong? There's a recurring character in your book, Larry Summers, who I believe has been wrong about almost everything. I mean, just like consistently, not just like I disagree with him, but just has come up and just been wrong, right? It kind of brings up the old George Carlin quote, like it's a big club and you ain't in it. And once you're in the club, you're always listening to, like, you are somebody who has been inside and outside of that world. It must be incredibly frustrating for you. But I wonder how you explain that, for instance, at a moment like 2008, when Barack Obama is coming into office, 2009, and he has this huge mandate to do something, and he's still listening, or the Democratic Party, if you will, is still listening to the people whose deregulatory policies got them into that situation. What do you make of that? What is that about?
It's about a deference to financial expertise. I think this is the Achilles heel of the Democratic Party, or at least the presidential Democratic Party. There was no reason to be so deferential to Wall Street. There was no reason for Bill Clinton to listen to Wall Streeters when he deregulated Wall Street, or there was no reason for him to deregulate Wall Street. There was no reason for Barack Obama to take those same Wall Streeters that got the economy into that much trouble, that were actually in some very important way responsible for the collapse or near collapse of 2008, and give them the authority that Obama gave them in terms of making economic policy. It's suicidal.
We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, Robert Reich tells us about the missed opportunities of Joe Biden's presidency and why, despite decades of disappointment, Reich believes we should be optimistic about the future. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Lever Time. So let's quickly recap Robert Reich's Forrest Gump-like journey up until this point. Reich was there when the Democrats missed their chance to avert the Nixon presidency and the Reagan Revolution. Reich was in the White House when Bill Clinton failed to resuscitate the Democratic Party after the Reagan-Bush years. And then after 8 years of the ensuing Bush-Cheney rampage, Reich was part of the Obama transition team. And in that role, he was trying to sound the alarm when Obama chose to turn hope and change into more of the same Wall Street fealty that had weakened the Democratic Party and that would eventually create the backlash conditions for Donald Trump's victory in 2016. So then, after the first 4 chaotic years of that Trump presidency, Democrats found themselves with yet one more opportunity to finally reset the political landscape with Joe Biden's election in 2020.
We've won with the most votes ever cast on presidential ticket in the history of the nation. 74 million.
From the outset, it seemed clear that Biden had actually learned some lessons from the past 2 Democratic presidencies. His economic program was a break from his predecessors, and in my view, a whole lot better than what Democrats had been offering in the last few years. And yet, those better policies failed to shift the dynamic in American politics. So I asked Robert Reich what he thinks went wrong, and whether he thinks the Democratic Party and the entire country can ever recover from what we're now going through in Trump's second term. Let's transition to Joe Biden. Seems to me that he abandoned much of his Senate record as more of a neoliberal and actually learned some real lessons from the Clinton and Obama years. He puts forward a much bigger stimulus, much tougher labor regulations, much stronger antitrust enforcement. And his critics now look at that and say that for that, he was rewarded with bad approval ratings. There was a recent New York Times column by Tom Edsall saying that in areas like Texarkana, the Texarkana region, that materially benefited from Biden's policies, they ended up actually voting more strongly for Trump than ever. And that is sort of cited as, if you do what people like Robert Reich, the policies that Robert Reich wants, that the progressive wing wants, it won't result in a different kind of politics. What do you make of what happened to Biden pushing that agenda on policy in a lot of ways successfully? That when a president actually delivered more of the kinds of things that you and I want, it didn't necessarily shift voters in the way that perhaps we'd want.
Well, the great tragedy of Joe Biden was as a communicator. I mean, not only was he getting very old and infirm, but even at the start of his administration, he was not able to put across an idea. When Teddy Roosevelt talked about it being a bully pulpit, he was talking about it being a place where you could educate the public about what the public needed. It's not enough to have the right policies. If you have the right policies and you don't have the capacity to educate the public, you might as well be on the moon or on the outer rings of Saturn. I mean, here's the irony today. We have a president who actually, although his syntax is awful and the words he uses are garbagey, but he's a communicator. He makes people believe that he's telling the truth. He's a great con man, not a good con man. He is a great con man. Bill Clinton was a good communicator, I think an excellent communicator. Barack Obama had a way with words, which was quite extraordinary. But Joe Biden, here we have the great irony, the sadness of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden doing the right thing, coming up with policies with antitrust and labor and the right economic policies, stimulating the economy at exactly the right time in the right way. And Joe Biden cannot explain it to the American public. They don't hear it. They don't know it to this day.
A lot of the case that you make is a case about the Democratic Party not doing what it needs to do to combat what has happened, ultimately culminating in Trump. And it led to a party that seems out of touch with the working class. And yet these issues, frankly, have not really been hashed out in Democratic primaries, to my mind, since at least 2008. 2016, a little bit, although, the Bernie-Hillary race. But that was a much more polite affair than 2008, where they really went at it. There's been this penchant for decorum, the idea being that Democrats should always be first and foremost nice to each other. Should primary candidates like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who I worked for, should they have been harsher, more explicit against the Democratic establishment? Should the next batch of Democratic candidates be willing to be more outspoken about these issues that you talk about in Democratic primaries? Or do you buy the argument that hashing it out like that weakens the party?
No, I don't think hashing it out weakens the party. I think it strengthens the party. There is no party. David, can we just be clear about it? We're talking about a structure that now is nothing more than, at best, or maybe at worst, a money-making or a fundraising system. No, the Democratic Party, if it's going to have a real message and stand for anything, it's got to hash these things out. The progressive populists, the Bernie Sanders legacy, they have got to speak out. They've got to say that the corporate Democrats and the Wall Street Democrats are simply wrong. There is no midpoint. There is no center between fascism and democracy. There is no moderate middle. We've got to embrace the things that we have been talking about for years and years. And Bernie is exactly right. Hats off to him. And other people, AOC is correct. Let's not worry. The Democratic Party, the movers and shakers, are gnashing their teeth over Mamdani. Well, please, let's understand there is a new generation of young Democrats coming up, and some of them sound very much like Bernie Sanders. Hooray! Embrace them. Let's make that the future of the Democratic Party. If it's not them, who is it?
In your book, you write about the anti-establishment rage that has clearly been brewing in America before Trump was elected in 2016. And I think it's not well understood that democracy has been on the rocks long before Trump came on the scene. I wonder why you think it has taken Donald Trump's ascent to wake people up. I wonder if you think it's almost false to lay the blame of the democracy crisis solely on Trump, even though obviously he is a culmination of it.
Well, my book is very much an argument that Trump should not be blamed for all of this. Trump is the culmination. He's the consequence of 40 years in which this country not only took things for granted, but did not notice that the median wage was flattening and that there were things that could be done but were not being done because the moneyed interests did not want them done. And the Democratic Party went along, and much of the country went along because there was no voice. If your choices are either Trump or nothing, you're just going to take Trump because at least he's giving you something. This is why I, again, in the few moments every day that I'm an optimist and I'm thinking everything's going to work out, I say to myself, this needed to happen. We could not have stayed on the road we were on. We had to see the consequences of what we had done. And now that we see the consequences, maybe we have a fighting chance when this darkness is ended. If it ends, we have a fighting chance of creating a society, a democracy, an economy that really does work for most people.
Robert Reich is the former U.S. Secretary of Labor and the author of the #1 New York Times best-selling book, Coming Up Short, A Memoir of My America. I just really appreciate you having fought the fights that you have fought for as long as you have and offering up a kind of optimism that the fight is worth the fight, even when it seems dark, even when it seems difficult. So I just want to personally thank you for that.
Thank you, David. And I thank you too.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Robert Reich's new book is called Coming Up Short, A Memoir of My America. We'll link to it in our show notes. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my interview with Robert Reich, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. You'll get extended and bonus interviews, ad-free episodes, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back later this week with another episode of Lever Time.